Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to this episode of Straight Talk on Insights into Leaders Solving Problems. Every week, we ask 3 questions of an expert who can share their insights on how to address some of the burning issues leaders are asking about. Hello, hello, hello to everyone. This is Dragisa, and welcome to another episode of Straight Talk for Business. Today, I have a very special guest. His name is George Elerick, and George is a behavioral scientist and the founder of an organization called Nudge Culture. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Dragisa. Thank you so much for having me as a guest, and thank you for your hospitality, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
So before we get started, so there's a little bit of context here. I think an important part to getting us started in this conversation is just please help our listeners understand a bit more about what is behavioral science.
Yes, so behavioral science is actually a multidisciplinary field. It usually is perceived as a kind of singular field where we study behavior and we put behavior under the microscope. And it's not just individual behavior, it's corporate behavior. It's the way in which we all relate to one another in social context and in different social contexts. And so we might, create some sort of project within the field where we're trying to understand certain behaviors and how they react to certain stimuli or certain decisions or certain environmental effects that we all interact with on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, behavioral science might try to seek to understand why we make choices and the way that we make them in the consumer market. Why do we shop the way we shop? And so a lot of the field seems to be focused around consumer decision making, but that's not the whole field. That's just a very large field right now that's being hyper focused on. But behavioral science really seeks to kind of put human behavior and choice making under the microscope and try to understand humans at the microscopic level.
Wonderful. So, as you and I had talked before, one of the things that I've spent a lot of time focusing on, particularly the last several months, is the whole issue that organizations have with setting strategy, executing strategy, and some of the dismal failures that have happened with executing on strategy. Talk to me a little bit about how behavioral science, behavioral economics, which is also in your field of specialty, how does all of that affect how a strategy is set for a company?
Very good question. I think to fully understand that, we have to understand why I think behavioral economics or behavioral science might be necessary in a context like building out a strategy. And a lot of that is preceded by, I think, assumptions by someone who might be starting a company or someone who might be taking over a company that's already started. And so a lot of those decisions that are usually made, are defaults, right? We just depend upon whatever's already created. We depend upon what's already there. And yet when we do that and we want to make a change, we don't know exactly where to go. And so it creates either a fear of risk or it creates a kind of environment where we almost aren't really sure of what the trade-offs that are necessary to actually move forward are. And so sometimes we'll even be willing to lie to ourselves, and so I think part of the necessity of behavioral economics or, one kind of subfield within behavioral economics, obviously, is using nudges and behavioral strategies, is to create these micro steps to goals, even changing cultures, all the way up to changing how a leader might deploy a strategy. Maybe, initially they might have been, very dictatorial or whatever it is, and they're trying to maybe change their style. So what behavioral economics and behavioral science seeks to do is to take a much larger issue and essentially make them into these micro steps that lead to the eventual goal. And so I think for me, that's the importance or the value of actually including a behavioral science strategy or behavioral economic strategy in any form of any context like a business.
I want to pick up on something you just said that I think is a really valuable point to go a little bit further on. And I'll explain why I'm asking. So you mentioned about trade-offs that have to be made when setting strategy. So I think a lot of the world would agree to say that most strategies are set and the directions that companies follow is for profit. Of course, many organizations are also established to be of service to the consumer, whoever, or the customer, whoever that may be. So let me point to something that I just picked up on this morning. The Economist reported the profit levels of two pharmaceutical companies, very large pharmaceutical companies, one being GlaxoSmithKline, the other one being Pfizer, both of which had an important role to play in the pandemic. The second thing that The Economist reported on was the oil companies, and one specifically being BP. As we all know, the big Gulf disaster that happened a number of years ago with BP, they're finally in the clear. But not just profitable, George, they are in the profit margins in the billions of dollars. So where should some of the trade-offs be made with companies like that in times when the world is facing a pandemic? And as we begin to recover, we're now faced with huge inflation being greatly contributed to by the price of gas, right? How can you possibly reconcile the kinds of behaviors that we're seeing? They're not making the trade-offs. They're raking in the profits. And, here, the customer who is counting on being served, what's happening here?
I think that's a great question. And I don't think there's one easy answer, but I think from my perception, I think what's going on and from within the field of, behavioral science and behavioral economics, I think it would be easy to say that we're living in a time where the commodification of the human body has superseded the importance and value of simply just being human. So meaning that because you have these pharmaceutical companies who really, really focus around health, they seem to want to give you the perception of we're helping you and we're giving you a service or a product. But in the end, it's really about their bottom line, which is how much money can we make out of this? And so the human isn't as important in the scheme of things. In one sense, they're simply just a symbolic interaction, right? That is necessary for the company to make money. Now, this might sound extremely harsh, but the reason why there are no trade-offs is because the company's bottom line is not customer service or making the customer happy or making the consumer feel valued. It's how much money can we get out of the consumer? And so even in the midst of a global crisis, you still have this happening, especially and predominantly in free market environments where people are identifying and over-identifying with the free market identity. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that the company itself is not looking, again, to its role, which is we create products or services to help our consumers and to build that relationship, because the relationships don't matter anymore, right? It's now they are looking to how do we get the most out of this situation? And so they're turning what is really an unhelpful situation into an even wider gap, an even wider social gap between what it means to be a company who actually cares versus a company who is making a buck off of someone else.
Wow, that doesn't warm my heart at all.
Sorry, it is a bit dark.
Well, sometimes reality is very harsh, unfortunately. Let's turn a little bit over now to decision making, and the topic of neuroscience has become quite visible. I always thought of myself as somebody that read very broadly, but neuroscience seems to have surfaced lately and has become very, very interesting. When they talk about critical thinking and all of that, really important. So Talk to me a little bit about the role of neuroscience in the decision-making process. What do we think about and how do we think about stuff when we have to make important decisions? Is there a generalization you might be able to make?
Yes. That's a great question, by the way. And I mean, we could probably spend a whole another podcast just exploring this. But, I think if I were to turn this into some sort of, achievable soundbite, I would say that we are creatures of habit. And so is our brain, right? Our brain is constantly scanning day in and day out for threats, for example, right? And that's just due to our evolutionary ancestors. Thank you, right? And so we are constantly dependent upon memory as a form of identity. And so part of that memory is going through our day and going through each and every environment that we encounter. And our brain is simply asking, have we been here before? Have we seen this environment before? Have I interacted with this particular stimuli in some other context? If I have, your brain will do and create this process through the hippocampus, which is partly where you form your identity through memories. And then it will actually kick on or ignite the basal ganglia, which is all about action. But here's the thing about the basal ganglia and action. Your action is encoded. What that means is that your action is already pre-planned. So if you, for example, if you live in the savannah where you have, these huge animal threats, and then you go into another environment where there's no animals, but you feel that same type of threat, your brain's going to kick into fight or flight mode. So you're automatically going to react to your environment, even though you visually know there's not some sort of visual or physical threat in your environment. But because of your perception, you've literally turned on the switch in your brain that says, listen, I feel like I'm in danger and I need to leave or I need to fight, right? And so, a very, very simple example would be, let's say, if you're someone who might, identify as an introvert and you go into a new job situation, but you feel like, the butterflies in the stomach, whatever all of those feelings are, which are typically experienced in threat-based environments, your brain won't say, oh, this isn't a savanna-based environment and you're not experiencing some sort of huge animal threat. It's just going to say, hey, this looks and feels like what you experienced over here, which could literally kill you. So I'm going to tell you, hey, you need to run. Or you need to fight. You have a choice, but you need to do it now, right? And so what happens is over time, we depend upon and we identify, and this is actually the danger, but also the importance to recognize, is that through our choices, we end up creating a pattern in our brain, right? And so what happens is if you think of the brain like a map, when we create certain streets on that map, our brain only relies upon the way in which we've decided and made that decision. So then this is why we always say, it takes a lot of work to change the mind, because you're literally changing the pathways in your brain when you're trying to change your sense of self or sense of identity, and you're trying to actually act upon a different environment, right? But also say, listen, I'm not a threat here. And so you have to literally calm yourself down and you have to almost kind of like talk yourself out of it, to actually change your brain and say, listen, I'm not in a threat. So this is like our daily life, is that we are constantly aware of threats, even though you and I aren't thinking about them now, that we are literally just surveying everything in our environment for possible threats. Now we can train ourselves out of that, with things like mindfulness and other scientific and science-based methods, right? But I do think it's important to understand that when it comes to neuroscience and decisions, most of our decisions are kind of pre-planned for us, right? And so, it does mess with the idea of, well, do I have free will? Well, neuroscience may not necessarily really have an opinion in this area, but if you really, really take that research literally, you might even argue that humans don't have free will unless we actually change our own mental patterns.
So that's interesting then. In a business environment, what you were saying, how we change our mind. So does that same principle apply when you're trying to change behaviors? Which comes first, change the behavior or change the mind? Or mindset, I suppose.
Yes. So that's a great question. So And I think it's an important one. And what I would say to that question is that I think there's a few things going on here. So when we're trying to understand what, especially in a business context. So first of all, we have to say, okay, this is the context within which we are. We're in a business context, we're at a job, we're in an organization, we belong to this. So we have to understand that our identity will already then be shaped by the expectations and anticipations and also our own perceptions. And how those link together will also create a behavioral pattern of how we think we need to act to be in that particular context, right? Whether we're the leader or whether we're the employee, whether we're the janitor, whatever the role is, we will have what's referred to as a signifying chain of identity-based descriptors. So let me make sense of that. So if you are a person who is, okay, I'm an accountant, right? So if I'm an accountant, then part of that signifying chain, which means it's kind of like a link. Right? Do you remember those kind of things that kids used to have to do? And they were like these kind of closed loop pieces of construction paper that you have to tape together and then connect together.
Yeah.
And so on.
Yeah.
So that's what a signifying chain is. So what it is I'm an accountant in a company who then is basically also expected to, okay, one, I have to be honest. So that's one signifying chain. I can't lie about what I'm doing, right? Or I'll go to prison. So then, then on top of that, I have a boss, but then on top of that, that boss has a boss. So then there's all these expectations. So all of these expectations become ways in which I define myself in and through my environment. So that's just in this one work environment that we're constantly dependent upon, not one way in which we identify our roles and responsibilities and behaviors, but that there's a connective tissue that's consistently being measured either by ourselves or by those outside of us. And so we're constantly mentally kind of checking in. Okay, am I doing this? Is this the type of employee I am? And so when you're in the work environment as it relates to identity and behaviors, my thing is like if you're to go into a work environment to change behaviors, my first thing would be not to change the behaviors. And that's why the company that I'm the CEO of is we're about nudging culture, not nudging behavior. Now, that sounds like it's a cop-out, but there is a reason because, and there's a lot of research behind this, neuroscience as well as social theory, in that basically our identity is not framed by ourselves. Now, again, in a Western culture where we hyper focus on the individual and the individual self, and we confuse, and I say this on purpose, identity with freedom and freedom with choice, then we automatically think that all of those are tied together, rather than those are actually separate identities that we tie together, right? We are the meaning makers. So what happens in a work scenario is that when we're trying to understand how this operates, we look to culture. What are the cultural values? Now, when I say culture, I don't mean just the outside world culture, what's on the news, what's valued on social media, but our culture is also kind of predetermined by our childhood, by our relationships with our parents, by the language that we learn, by who and how we interact in school settings. All of those things for me are cultural contributors to who we think we are, whether that be an individual or whether that be a company culture, right? And so that's the one thing that I find failing in a lot of companies is that they don't look enough to culture. They either look to their competitors, which in my opinion is a waste of time because you're literally using your competitor to frame your understanding of yourself and identity as a culture. Right. But the reality is that there are other cultural contributors that have nothing to do with your competitor, and so for me, when I'm coming in and I'm interacting from a behavioral science perspective, it's what's the culture here? What's the culture that has been laid down in this workplace, whether this is day one for that workplace or whether this is day 350? What are the cultural values? Like, for example, and I'll end with this, is if you walk into a company and you have a very, very controlling leader, that's going to have a very different culture than someone who is very postmodern and kind of dismantles the hierarchy and looks at everybody as equal contributors. That's going to have a very different culture. And so for me, that's the most important factor when you're going in to looking to change behaviors is culture first, then behavior, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes absolutely total sense because, talking with some of my clients, former and current, And one of the things that is coming into conversations these days is just what you've said, is that, they have consultants approaching their HR departments and saying, the future of work is going to be driven by a very different culture. But I haven't heard it explained the way you have just now. And I think there are people out there who are wanting to have a very significant impact on culture, be drivers of change in culture, who don't understand the significance of doing that. But I think you've just nailed it in terms of there's a sequence of things that has to happen. It sounds to me, I mean, that's how I understood it. You don't, you have to respect the sequence, and there's only so much capacity to do at any one point in time. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, 100%. And I would say that sequence is already predetermined if you're coming in as a behavioral scientist and trying to assess a situation, because you're not coming in to change behaviors. Because in my perspective is that if you go in and change the behaviors and the culture hasn't been changed at all, eventually all of those things will come back into place. All of those habits, again, because we're creatures of habit, right? So that's what the neuroscience says, is we're going to default. This is why resolutions don't work, is because we don't really change the concept of ourselves. We literally just change hey, this is really social proof, right? This is going to make me look good. Or we might adopt the halo effect, like, hey, Beyonce's doing this, so I should do this, right? And so we end up adopting all of these biases that make us feel like we're in control of our environment, but really they're just biases that are literally turning our steps into mechanical choices rather than the freedom that we actually want.
Wow, that is super helpful to know, and to understand on a certainly deeper level. So, some of what I'd like to touch on next is beyond the culture, and when you look at a lot of global companies. Earlier, I used the example of the pharmaceuticals. Also the fossil fuel driven organizations, but you also have, global consumer products companies. You've got retailers that are selling globally and so on. So in order for the economics going forward to work for everyone, okay, so thinking of behavioral economics, okay, going forward, what has to change so that the economics have to work for everyone? From a behavioral standpoint, what has to change?
Yeah, I think first ideology. I think, and when I say ideology, I don't mean just the framework of thinking, because ideology carries with it a set of behaviors and a set of actions and a set of values. Think of it as like a party bag, right? Like when you go to these parties, you're going there to experience the party, but then you get the party bag, which comes with all of the extras. And so this is kind of, I think, a simple metaphor to kind of get the point across that, like, basically it's all kind of thrown in. Ideology is not just, hey, that's the way you think, or that's the way you've been taught, or that's the kind of cultural perpetuation of ideas. Those are all part of it. But at the same time, it's a way in which we identify through those ideas, and then those ideas will have this residual sequential effect of us making choices based on the way in which we identify with that ideology. So, I realize that's a whole bunch of words, but is basically, I think the first thing is that we need to change our perception. We need to change our worldview. That's really, really what it comes down to. We need to change the idea of, like, if we're going to deal with global economy and we're going to deal with what's going on in the world, right? Whether it be dealing with the reality of a pandemic or the reality of class systems across the world, the reality of social and economic and ideological disparity, all of those things are all related. It's all part of a system. And so if we look at it as a system, right, yes, they are individual phenomenon, but they are all actually backed up and propped up by a system that wants to keep things the way it is. So there's a great book, and I usually don't recommend books, but it's by a neuroscientist, and his name is Antonio Damasio. And so he talks about the neuroscience of what culture is. And the book is called The Strange Order of Things. And in it, he says, listen, culture is all about homeostasis. Culture is all about finding balance. That's all we want. So he says, this isn't just the culture within our mind. This is the culture within the world, because really the world is determined by what we think about it. Right. And so if we, have a massive view that, poor people aren't working hard enough. Well, that's going to have a massive residual effect on how you act in the world and act towards those particular people, and so on and so forth. If you hate the economy, that's going to have a massive knock-on effect of how you relate to the economy, and so on and so forth. And so I think when I say ideology, people are going to be like, oh, that's too simplistic. But see, when I'm trying to define it, I'm saying, listen, the ideology actually helps determine the behaviors and the values and the systems that we already currently have in place. So for me, when people tend to ask me like, hey, what's going on or what can we do? I'm always asking the step before, because the problem is what happens is there's a tendency to walk into a situation, and this is what a lot of people do, especially leaders and CEOs who come to companies that have already been there prior to them, is they just jump in. They don't really think what's been here before. Why am I here? First off, right? Maybe there's a reason why whatever was there before didn't work, right? And why they need me here now. But we usually just jump in. And I think that's what has happened in the global economy. And this is going to sound extremely crude, but I think we need to think more. I think we need to be critical more. I don't think we're thinking enough, and we're not thinking critically enough in and through the way in which the economy is and what it's really meant to be. Now, is and can utopia be developed through a global economy? Probably not. I mean, Thomas More, when he wrote that book, it was satire, right? And so the idea of utopia, I think, is a pipe dream. That's going to sound very pessimistic, but that does not mean that we cannot build micro utopias, little pockets of humanity where we begin looking at things through the lens of relationships first, then whatever we want to deploy after that. Right. And so for me, I think we need to deal with ideology, and then we need to realize whatever we're dealing with, whether it's the economy, politics, a pandemic, everything should primarily be perceived through the lens of relationship, not anything else, at least initially. That's what I would think.
And I think that is a great point, especially for business. Whether you're a company that has 50, 500, 5,000, or 50,000 people, being able to look externally, but then develop the internal culture that suits those people is the important part. Be very aware of what's going on out in the world, because you can't change it all in one day, and you certainly can't change it all alone, for sure. But yeah, fix the insides first and take it from there. So, a lot of what we talked about could be a bit of overwhelm, I think sometimes, and when I look at a medium-sized or even a pretty big company, and they're challenged to effectively execute the strategy. I think you've just given us a whole lot of reasons why, and how they might take a little bit of advice and start to look forward a little bit differently than how it's been done in the past. Like you said, a leader just jumps in and does it without giving due consideration to their environment, internal and external. So yeah, I think very, very good discourse and advice for some of these. So George, I'll ask you, any last bit of insight you want to share with listeners?
Oh, great. I think when it comes to behavior, don't be hard on yourself. I think especially today, when we're hyper-focused on trying to understand human behavior through the machine, right? So, one of the areas that we use tools from in nudge culture is cognitive science. But I have a love-hate relationship with cognitive science because cognitive sciences really rely upon a machine understanding of the brain, a machine understanding of the body, a machine understanding of human behavior. And so I think at the end of the day, we're none of those. We are none of those. And so, the best way that we can try to understand the human experience is that really, organically speaking, we're just a mess. I mean, we're a mess of chemicals. We are people who are trying to understand what it means to be human in the midst of a lot of environmental factors that may or may not be out of our control. And so I want to free people up to be able to be like, you know what? It's okay if I'm human in the midst of all of this. It's okay if I'm not a machine. It's okay if I don't always understand my biases, And so that for me, I think is extremely important because again, in today's world where we've almost turned perfectionism into a form of religion, we need to kind of reduce that addiction. And we need to come back to this kind of almost Eastern understanding. And by Eastern, I don't mean Asia. I mean like the ancient near Middle East, where we might call Iraq today. Their idea of perfection, and I think this is a great, great definition, is that it's progress. So we hear the word perfection today and we think I have to be whole, I have to be perfect, and everything has to come together, and I have to look good on social media, I have to look good everywhere. But in the ancient near Middle East, they said, listen, the moment you stop changing is the moment you stop being perfect. So perfection is about growth. Perfection is about the desire for growth. The perfection is about the pursuit of growth. And so that's what I would like to encourage everybody with.
Yeah, I had not heard that before, and I like that. I like the way you defined it. And okay, so I think we'll wind it up here for today. George, I'd love to have you back because I think I could talk to you all day long.
Same here.
Anyway, thank you so much for talking with me today. This has been absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Dragasa. I appreciate you and what you're doing in the world. I think what you're doing in the world is necessary. I think people need a sounding board, and I think you're perfect for it. So thank you for your hospitality, and thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you so much. So there you have it, folks. Our conversation today with George Elerick, a behavioral economist and behavioral scientist, and he is the founder of Nudge Culture. He can be found on LinkedIn, and he shares his insights on a regular basis, and you can be pretty sure that we'll have him back again at some point in the near future. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time, this is Dragasa with Straight Talk for Business.